Welcome. My name is Maria Mendiluce. I'm the CEO of the Women Business Coalition that put in place the business pavilion, as you can see. We are all in for 1.5, and we came to COP not very sure if we were going to be there. And I have to say that our first message coming out of COP this week, second week, is that we are much closer to 1.5, and that's wonderful news. But it's not news for complacency, because there are lots of pledges, but now we need to move to action, right? We came to COP expecting countries to upgrade their NDCs, and we are halfway through that. And so we hope that through the new ratchet mechanism that hopefully is approved, countries will have to upgrade their ambitions every year. We also have seen at COP the emergence of nature as a really important part of the journey, not as a substitute, but actually as additional. So we hear the SBTi coming up with a new standard. We absolutely need to decarbonize emission and, in addition, invest in nature. But working with business for many years, what I have seen at COP is a shift of the conversation from the why and the what to actually the how. And this is what we're going to be talking today. That how needs to be guided by science and needs to be adjusted to science. And that how is, companies are looking at how to do it in their own operations, and they're doing a pretty good job. They're investing, etc. And the challenge for companies is the how can we decarbonize the supply chain? Because between 50 and 95 of their emissions come from the supply chain. And so I'm sure that today we're going to speak a little bit about that. And my last point is about reporting progress. We have civil society, we have Greta, we have many people talking about the blah, blah, blah. And the only way to respond to the blah, blah, blah is with results. So we hope that in the next global stocktake, in a couple of years, business have come with results. We cannot expect the pledges to materialize the next day in emission reductions, but we have 2 years to go, and we need to be much more thorough in reporting progress. So it is my pleasure to welcome you and to introduce to Michel Frédeau, Managing Director and Senior Partner at Boston Consulting Group. I've worked a lot with Michel, so he's a good friend. In fact, I have worked with pretty much everybody that is on the panel, so it's always nice to see each other at COP. So Michel leads the Climate and Environment program at BCG globally, and he's going to be the moderator for this session. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you, everyone. So I'm quite excited about this panel because, as Maria said, we need to talk about action, and this is where the guests that we have today are going to be very interesting to listen to, because those companies and those CEOs are really moving to action. So I'm going to briefly introduce each one of them, and then we'll move to question. I'll start with Geraldine, who is the co-CEO and CFO of Royal DSM. She joined the company in 2014 and became co-CEO in 2020. She's also a board member of ABB. And of course, as you know, Royal DSM has been a front runner on climate, and with former CEO Feike Sijbesma, who serves as co-chair of the CEO Climate Leaders. Ramon is the chairman of the CEO of PepsiCo, the company behind Lay's potato chips, Quaker Oats, and Tropicana orange juice, and of course the PepsiCo drinks. He joined the company in 1996 and has served as its CEO in 2018. Under his leadership, PepsiCo pledged net zero emission by 2040, but also has a positive agriculture strategy aiming to reduce 3 million tons of GHG emission by 2030, and I'm sure that we'll talk about that. And last but not least, Jeremy is a senior partner and CEO of SystemIQ, a consultant that he founded in 2016 after 23 years at McKinsey. No one's perfect. SystemIQ focuses on catalyzing good disruptions and economic systems that will speed the achievement of the UN SDGs and the climate agreement. So you see that we have different industries, but really good momentum in terms of what these companies are doing. Maybe before we start the questions, really, I wanted to share with you just 4 numbers. The first number is $150 trillion is the transformation to a net zero economy, and that's the investment that will be required in the next 3 decades. And GFANZ is really committed, as you've seen, to finance or help finance that. 2% is the cost to get a decarbonized house or a decarbonized car. Yes, it increases the cost per ton of steel or cement by 80%. At the end, on the consumer, when you take the whole value chain, it's 2%. It took one company to disrupt the whole industry. Tesla showed the way that it was possible to have a 100% electrical car. Now everyone, the whole industry is moving to that. And 42% is the number of consumer and public at large that consider that most companies are only greenwashing. So I think that with these 4 numbers as introduction, you see that there's a lot to do. But that's why I would like to turn really to action and turn maybe to Geraldine and ask you about DSM. It's not a new journey. I mean, you're on the journey since a long, long time. So you've already reduced structural emission by 90% since 2016. But I would be interested to know what tools has Royal DSM put in place internally to achieve these goals of halving emission by 2030, and then we'll come out to the overall ecosystem. But start with yourself and your company.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Indeed, I think it's a good idea to just do a quick reminder that nothing really happens unless you get your organization behind you to make the kind of right actions to happen. So, indeed, we've been on the journey for quite a while. Some of the key enablers start with actually having dedicated teams. So it is important to have the skill sets in an organization to actually build those roadmaps. So you have to map your current footprint. We are a company based in science, so we have a lot of engineers, and therefore everything has to be substantiated, which is good, and then you drive from that. Being also a CFO by training, funding is important, so skills is one thing. Typically, we've ring-fenced budgets in order to be able to fund some things which maybe don't have this right kind of return on investment at first sight, but you need to think through it differently. And to think through it differently, we also introduced an internal price on carbon already many years ago. We started with 50 euros per ton. We're now at 100 euros per ton. And it's important to really, any capital investment or long-term investment, to think about what if this is a true cost of doing business, which is our philosophy, then how does it impact your decisions? So that's another driver. And another mechanism that we've put in place is effectively any business asking for capital needs to come up with a carbon neutral approach. So whatever extra they want, they need to offset somewhere else, which at first caused a lot of pushback in the organization because we also want to grow. So they were saying, how do we do that? But if you don't have your organization lining up, it's important. And maybe one of the things that still very few companies do is we embedded it in incentives. So both our STI and LTI, so short-term and long-term incentives, are both 50% financial and 50% non-financial, of which climate and greenhouse gas is a measured element, which means you need to have good data and reasonably assured data. So all of our non-financial data is actually at the same level of external audited quality than financials. And these are all bits and pieces of a toolkit that you need to put in place in order to embed both the mindsets and the practical aspects of driving decarbonization within an organization that has real tangible assets on the ground.
That's very compelling, thanks. And we will discuss also, because as you're science-based, I think that you have a lot to say also on the ability to innovate. So we will discuss about that in the next questions. So I'm turning back to Ramon now. On the PepsiCo side, you didn't limit yourself to just the climate pledge, in fact, but you did it for 2040. So that's quite a quick deadline. But in May, the company came out with a positive agriculture pledge as well, and a focus on regenerative agriculture. So the question is, can you explain how you use climate and natural goals come together? Because there has been a lot of discussion in the COP so far on climate, and everyone, you have the impression, but don't forget about nature, don't forget about the biodiversity, the water, the waste, etc. So maybe having your story about how you look at this would be very interesting.
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I guess one of the secrets of PepsiCo is that we're 60% a food company. So we're PepsiCo is the branding, but 60% of our business is food, and that means that we source, I think it's 24 crops in 60 countries. So clearly agriculture is very essential for us. And it's actually 1/3 of our gas emissions. When we map all our gas emissions, agriculture is responsible for 33%. So clearly for us, if we want to become net zero by 2040, which is a big commitment we're making as a team, we need to play on agriculture big time. Actually, when we presented our strategic plan, PepsiCo Positive, which is our strategic transformation to change the way we source, the way we manufacture, the way we market our brands. There's a pillar which is positive agriculture. So agriculture is very critical for us. And we have about a 7 million acres footprint. That's our current footprint. And our goal is to transform all those 7 million acres to regenerative agriculture. And there's some levers we can play as a large company. Obviously, there is our procurement. So we're changing all our procurement practices to source regenerative agriculture suppliers from. But we need to help them. There's a few things we're doing that are meaningful. We realize the farmers don't have the know-how. So when you visit a farmer, even in large countries like in the US, they don't have the know-how how to move from current practices to regenerative practices. And there is a journey for them. We're doing demo farms around the world. We're doing certain, and it's not only a PepsiCo effort, we're joining with other companies to train the farmers on what it means and how the future could be. However, there is a lag between the moment they start changing their practices and the moment their P&L becomes positive. And that is a journey of about 3 to 4 years. And that's where we need to intervene. We need to intervene helping them with transition funding. We need to intervene with supporting the governments to change some of the subsidies. We need to help them with changing some of the insurance company practices that don't incentivize them to move to those spaces. So clearly, it's an ecosystem journey. But we think that if we elevate nature as a key contributor for planet solution, it is great for all of us. And I think between all the large companies, we can help both from the technical point of view, from the financing point of view, from the helping the governments change some of their current practices, and that would create the energy and the momentum to get agriculture into a better place. So I'm very happy that in this COP, and I'm not that familiar with previous COPs, but I think nature was elevated for the first time to a key priority in climate change. We're linking nature with climate. We're linking food with nature and climate. And that's how we're going to eventually be able to go to consumers and help them understand that their choices with the food or the brands they choose, they have an impact eventually in nature and eventually in climate. So those are connections. We can talk later about how we're trying to play that game. It's a long-term game. I think consumers will take a while to get educated on this area, but there is a clear connection that for the first time we're elevating, and I'm very, very happy that this is one of the key outcomes for me of this COP 26.
So indeed, there's this connection between climate and nature in food. It's clear, but it's true also in other sectors. But there's also the connections between the different building blocks of the system, between regulators, investors, companies, and public at large, us, in terms of our behaviors. So Jeremy, turning back to you, as your company name is Systemic, I think you've been focusing all your work and all your energy on making the system work. So maybe you can tell us why the system is so important and what you think actions are the most important to think of after this COP.
Michel, thank you. And we clearly picked a good name, right? Because I go around and people are always talking about systemic change. And I'm hopeful that we're
the next company I'm going to launch is going to be Change. And maybe eventually we'll merge.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. You have a deal. So look, I think that both Geraldine and Ramon's contributions give you the kind of the essence of the story. I'm going to take us a moment back, right? Why do climate and nature have to come together, right? They're not interesting parallel tracks where wouldn't it be nice if we had biodiversity as well as climate, right? But if I just make one of the obvious connections, and there are many, over the last 100 years, nature has absorbed over half of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have as humans been generating through the Industrial Revolution. And they've been absorbing it into the forests, and they've been absorbing them into oceans, and into many other biomes. But we, of course, have now got to a place where we are weakening those biomes and those, if you will, forms of natural capital to such an extent that the Amazon is now seen as, and is measured as generating, as becoming a carbon source rather than a carbon sink. What we have are a set of tipping points in some key, if you will, natural assets upon which all life on the planet depends. So if we do not rebuild and regenerate nature, and in return are able, in effect, to continue to benefit from nature's ecosystem services, and in this case it's absorption of greenhouse gases, you can write off the rest of the climate agenda. We can do as much as we like on energy, but we will not solve the problem. So the idea that we should have a climate COP and a nature COP and they happen separately is madness, right? It's madness. We have got to find ways to integrate from first principles, and the first principles do come down to the science. If I go from the science now to what Ramon said, which I loved, and both of you, I think, made this point, it is awesome, and I know a little bit about what you're doing at Pepsi, and you know, proud that we were a bit in the mix. It's awesome that you're getting after 7 million hectares of agricultural land, but of course what we need, we have roughly 4 billion, right, relevant hectares of agricultural land.
Very small.
And however big Pepsi is, and you're huge in many ways, you're huge, but you're tiny relative to the challenge that we face. And so what we need to have happen is effectively, and the way we look at it is, we've got to have in our heads the billion hectares, right? We can't do all 4, but we've got to get our head around what does it take to do 1 billion hectares regeneratively and in a way that actually doesn't always feel like it's pushing. Right? If you're always pushing, not pulling, right, then there's a problem. So how do we create this incredible pull in the system, right, to make 1 billion hectares not something that we kind of talk about and it's happy talk and it's another pledge for some distant forum, but about action, right? And that is where bringing together the demand side, right, which in many respects you represent, the supply side with the innovations and the solutions and all the cool new stuff, the data, the policy, and of course the finance. And you, in order to solve for a problem that is called 1 billion hectares happening within the next 10 years in a way that creates multiple, not one tipping point, but multiple tipping points, we have to orchestrate the system. And fundamentally, the system, at its simplest, boils down to the components of supply, demand, finance, technology, policy, intelligently orchestrated, and with clear accountability in terms of, are we making progress? If not, what's getting in the way? What do we need to fix it? And then how do we make more progress? So that's what system change work is about.
That's very clear and quite compelling, having all the different elements.
Take the quite out.
Right, yeah. I mean, building on that, I will come back to Ramon. So most, as you said, I mean, most of your emissions, coming back to emissions, is coming from scope 3. And at the same time, you need to also influence consumer behavior. And that can be complicated in the absence of standards or regulation. What concrete actions are you taking to address these? And what makes you confident that you will address them to get really to the net zero?
I mean, this is the real journey, you know, that we're talking about. Yes, and we're not different from the majority of consumer good companies. So most, in our case, scope 1 and 2 is 8% of our gas emissions. Scope 3 is the 92%. So we clearly cannot solve for this problem internally. We have to build ecosystems that will eventually address the problem. In our case, we go backwards, so into our suppliers, and obviously we have supplier processes where we are all trying to move in the same direction. One of the things you're saying, we're 7 million out of 1 billion, but we have a big impact on a lot of suppliers. For example, we're asking our suppliers, all of them, to have a science-based target to get to net zero. I mean, that in itself is a big effort. So they are all, and we're helping them. Obviously, some of them are medium-sized companies, smaller-sized companies, farming companies, and we're helping them to have science-based targets. And that is a journey that we want to help them through. At the same time, there's a lot of coalitions that we're working together. There was an announcement this week from the Consumer Good Forum on a commitment to avoid deforestation. That is, you know, we're a small part of that. When you put together big retailers, when you put together all the other large manufacturers, then we mean much more, and that there's a very clear commitment. Now, the big challenge for all of us is we need to convince the consumer. I mean, once we pivot the consumer to new habits, then we have the whole system will be aligned, the economics will be aligned, the demand will create supply. And that is the big challenge. In our case, we're clearly seeing that the consumer, as I said earlier, doesn't get this principle that what you choose to eat or drink has a clear impact in nature and has a clear impact in emissions. So we're trying to do that. For example, if you guys walked around this market, this summer we moved all our Pepsi products to 100% recycled, you know? And we made it very obvious on the label. So now 100% recycled is the brand. What does it mean? Well, it means a 40% reduction in that product. So a Pepsi Max, Pepsi No Sugar, between virgin plastic and recycled plastic is a 40% less carbon emission. We're working also, for example, with Lay's in taking the peel from the potato and make it fertilizer. It's pretty advanced. Now, if you take a regular Lay's or Walkers here in the UK, and what is going to be once we get this fertilizer going is 80% less gas. And those are ways that we think that if we start communicating and we make the communication of the brands center around these benefits, we will eventually communicate to consumers the right connection between choices and the planet, and it's going to be a competitive advantage for us, and hopefully we pivot the consumer. Other things we're doing, I don't know if you guys are familiar with SodaStream. SodaStream is a new consumption model for beverages. Clearly, if you think about pivoting a lot of the consumption from the existing bottle or can into a SodaStream model, and we're putting our, all our flavors in that solution, there's a massive reduction in gas emission, in plastic consumption, in a lot of inputs for the same consumer experience. And actually, the consumer experience can even be better because you can personalize it to your own needs versus us telling you what to drink. So clearly, we're trying to create consumption models that are consumption models of the future, where the consumer is enabled to create their own drinks, where the consumer is clearly making an impact to the planet, Another example we're doing in the US is Gatorade. Gatorade is a huge brand globally. We're trying to move Gatorade from a plastic bottle to powders and tablets. It's actually better, you know, if you're an athlete, you know, you put more powder or less powder. You decide what you do, and we can actually do specific powders for you. So now we give you a patch. You sweat. You send us the patch. We understand your hydration needs, and we give you specific powders. So now you create your own drink without bottle, without carbonation. Without transportation. It's better for you, it's better for the planet. That is the concept, how we think we can influence consumers and use the brands as the advocates of this transformation. The three of us talking about this doesn't make an impact. If those brands talk to consumers, they are so loyal to those brands, they love those brands, they're going to eventually pivot to new consumption. And we believe in that. And we think it's, obviously for us, selfishly, is a competitive advantage. We think we can create more value. Hopefully for the planet, we're doing also a good job.
So thank you for sharing these examples. I've been talking to other consumer goods companies that are in the journey, but they are hesitating in going too fast because of the consumer reluctance and probably the lack of green premium and hesitating to do that. I think what is really compelling is, and therefore they're waiting for standards so that, the whole industry moves into this, which does slow down the process, in fact. But what I think is interesting is you're not hesitating in changing. In fact, your innovation changed completely the business model. And you're ready to offer to consumers a different way to use products that are carbon compatible and offer a better experience. So that's, I think, I find very interesting. Coming back to DSM, now that we're talking about innovation, and you're a science-based company, so innovation, you know what you're talking about. How do you embark the supply chain and your customers into reshuffling completely your portfolio, because you've been innovating and changing your whole portfolio over years? How do you do that?
Well, first, before I go there, because I think I need to bounce back on what Jeremy was saying, and that is, that's absolutely good news that finally, the world is realizing that nature and climate go together, but I would add the word in the middle, food, because the one activity of humanity which has the biggest impact on our planet is actually food. And let's never forget that in one lifetime, from 1950 to today, we tripled the number of people on this planet. And it's an interesting statistic. In 1950, 70%, 70, of people suffered from hunger, actual hunger. Today, it's well below 10%, still far too much. But in some ways, humanity found very good ways of scaling the food, the production of calories of food. But unfortunately, at the expense of the impact on the planet. And in this context, what we've been looking at, and I won't go into all the topsoil loss, etc., and to your point, Ramon, on regenerative agriculture, how key it is that to sustain feeding our population on this planet, we need to find different ways of producing food. Now, to go into the practical things, more than 10 years ago, as DSM, we actually did an innovation ideation exercise. And we said, well, what can we contribute as the world's biggest producer of what makes food actually nutritious? So micronutrients for humans and for animals. And we looked at climate. And the other big word that's come out at the COP is methane. So we looked at actually a big source of methane is agriculture. 40% of methane actually comes from agriculture. So also a bit of a lacking part, I think these days, is when we talk about the methane pledge, people think oil and gas. Well, think food, think agriculture. And within that, a big source is actually livestock. So it is the burping of cattle in particular, which is a big contributor. Now, 10 years ago, we launched in our science thinking, how can we reduce the burping of cows? Which I have to say at the time was not seen as an obvious piece of work, neither by the farmers, nor by some of our customers in the food and beverage industry who said, excuse me, but not very relevant. Fast forward 10 years, it's highly relevant because, of course, methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. But also, if you're looking at diets, can we, while we try to shift diets to maybe more sustainable mix and going maybe with a bigger proportion of plant-based, etc., how do we, in parallel, reduce the impact of, for example, the dairy chain when it comes to livestock? And it's great that today, through this innovation, but you need to think ahead. Basically, I think my biggest message is, even if something doesn't seem obvious from a business model, anticipate and say, well, where are we? How can we do something with our skills? And today, this is called behaviour. It's an ingredient that goes into the feed of cattle. It's been fully approved in Brazil and in Chile, hopefully soon in other jurisdictions. And it reduces in dairy cows up to 30% the methane burps, which, by the way, has the fastest impact on climate is methane, and up to 80-90% in beef. Now, what it takes is an element of anticipation, but importantly, not everyone has the benefit of being backward integrated into your supply. So then you need to broaden the systemic conversation. So how do we start having regulations around greenhouse gas and farming and production? How do we have labeling which enables consumers to know that on a product this is, you know, a different production chain, a different impact that the food that they're choosing is having? So this is one of the examples, but fundamentally, when it comes to driving innovation and an innovation portfolio, the importance is not to stick. We have 3 horizons, 1, 2, and 3. Don't only think about today. Think about horizon 2 and 3 as well, because innovation takes time. And sometimes you realize later on, a next generation of leaders actually, that you have an innovation which is great for the world.
And do you feel that already there's a good demand from your customers, that they value those products, they understand, and they're willing to buy them?
Well, interestingly now, a lot of the dairy groups in the world are seeking to have net zero dairy products. So how do you get, you know, carbon neutral milk, which then, and then of course you have the whole production chain. So it's not just the milk, you have to think about transport and processing. You have to think about waste, which, by the way, we still waste 30% of food, so that's also a big contributor. But there is absolute demand and a great eagerness, actually, to see how do we embed that. And I think regenerative agriculture can scale as well. But it really, you're absolutely right, it requires a general demand from society. And so I really welcome all of the demonstrations which we've been seeing this week, because this is what creates the right momentum for not only us to start thinking maybe more broadly, more courageously, but then have things like the subsidies align with that and the technology align with it.
Very clear. And yes, we need push from everyone just to accelerate. So we haven't really talked about the high-emitting sectors, which are certainly an important element beyond food. And Jeremy, SystemIQ has been quite active on helping organizations like Mission Possible, which is the coalition of all of the high-emitting sectors. So you have a special vintage point here to tell us a little bit what you think the high-emitting sectors, airline, shipping, cement, chemicals, whatever, should be doing, are going to do, and your perspective about results and actions that we could expect in the next years?
So it's interesting, of course, because Geraldine is, of course, right. Food is today a high-emitting sector. It's actually quite a hard-to-abate sector, right? And you can measure these things in different ways, and if you go end-to-end on the value chain, the number looks like 25% of emissions in one form or another come from the food value chain. So I want us to recognize that what we tend to think of as high emitting and low emitting and hard to abate, these are labels. And it's so interesting to see what's going on in the food system. I had this exchange with Mark Carney last week where he was offering me his $130 trillion to actually drive the systemic change we need in the world. I immediately sent them in your direction, Michel. But my point to him was that that actually the food system needs way less than 10%. And we put numbers out there that says over the next 10 years, we need 5 trillion, an extra 500 billion a year for the food system. Maybe the number is 1 trillion, but it's a tiny percentage of that 130 trillion to unlock climate, nature, better health, better income for farmers. So I mean, I want to now bridge to your question, but I want us to understand that in fact, at this COP, we've seen nature show up much more than before. At the next COP, we absolutely need the food and ag sector to show up, not as a problem, but as a massive, massive part of the answer.
If I can add to that, I think that adaptation will move up in the agenda in a big way in the next stop, and you can't deal with adaptation without talking about the food system.
So this is,
I think,
and many of these solutions that we're talking about have benefits from a, if you will, reducing greenhouse gas point of view, but also from an adaptation point of view. They strengthen the resilience of our natural systems and strengthen the resilience of our agricultural
and Jeremy, it's fair to say the food system is the biggest culprit, but the biggest victim of climate change, and the biggest source of potential rapid adjustment.
So it's so interesting, and the capital requirements are relatively low compared to what's needed in the energy system. But what we do need to do is exactly what Ramon was talking about, is it's the two ends. It's consumers on the one hand, and helping them understand, when I'm consuming this product, am I actually contributing to a better world?
Jeremy, I haven't forgotten my question.
I haven't either.
Okay, steel and salmon, please.
I'll come back to it. But also the farmers, right? Now, on to your question, because it's not so different, right? In the steel and cement sectors, there are obviously differences, and they are, in terms of their institutional arrangements, more concentrated in terms of the production side of the system. But look, the Mission Possible partnership, for those that don't know it, so I want to give you the 1-minute advertisement, is this quite remarkable coalition that has come together with We Mean Business, with the Energy Transition Commission, which we run, with the World Economic Forum and Rocky Mountain Institute, but much more importantly, 7 key sectors. Right? So steel, cement, aluminum, chemicals from the, in a sense, the heavy industry side, the aviation, shipping and trucking. And these guys are between them about 15 gigatons of emissions. They are literally everybody's scope 3. They're everybody's scope 3 emissions. So they're hidden away, they're buried, right, out of sight and a little bit out of mind so far. And the purpose of the Mission Possible partnership is to create an industry-led, highly ambitious approach, using all the tools of system change, using the conviction of not just businesses in general, but we do believe we've got to align around in each sector, 10 to 20 very ambitious companies and their CEOs. And I don't mean to flatter CEOs, but you do need the CEOs to break some of the log jams and say, you know what, we're looking out there 10 years. I'm taking personal risk in taking my company on a journey here. I'm going to do it with others, because doing it on my own, right, doesn't achieve what we need to achieve. I've got to do it with others, but I'm going to bring in the civil society folk. I'm going to bring in the policy types. I critically, in those sectors, they are very, very capital intensive sectors. The technologies, this is one difference with food and ag, the technologies aren't really there. Right? And so there is a significant premium. If you want to do green steel today, you're right, Michel. In a way, from the buyer of a new car, it's not a big number, but that's not how those value chains operate, of course. Right? So an extra $100 a ton for green steel, or probably today, $200 to $300, just puts you out of the game, right? So we've got to get the, if you will, the policy side to come in.
A carbon price.
Right, exactly. It's that one, yes, right? As opposed to, I don't understand what's called a green premium, but anyway, that's a debate for another time. But we've got to have if we don't have a carbon price operating, as you rightly point out, at the right level, then what are the, if you will, the combination of other instruments that we need to use? And it's going to be some selective policies. It's going to be use of concessional finance to de-risk first-of-a-kind plants and the like. It's going to be procurement. It's public and private, getting those first, kind of fast-moving, customers to come through. And so the only way to solve for the steel story and the cement story is to combine this tremendous ambition that we are really seeing in the private sector. I've been at this game for 20 years. The level of not just words, but action is remarkable. But we've got to combine that with the policy types, the finance types, the science types, and get that system to de-risk, right, if you will, the first critical, if you will, steps along that S-curve.
So yeah, absolutely, very compelling. You insisted on the demand side, and there's, as I know, in the Mission Possible arena, a focus right now also on public sector, because big buyers of cement, of steel, and not all governments and all the purchasing powers of governments is not yet completely fully decarbonized, which links me to what I said. Pledges are great, but then you need to move to action. This one is a no-brainer, and it doesn't really happen yet, so we need to accelerate. But that's on the public side. To give them incentive, government incentive, on the private side, you've just heard John Kerry and the WEF announce the First Mover Coalition that goes exactly in the direction that you were saying, Jeremy, which is to help deploy those technologies at scale so that we will have decarbonized steel, decarbonized cement, decarbonized trucking, etc. in 2030 available and in the money. There's a number of climate leaders from the WEF and from beyond the WEF that are committing to purchasing those commodities so that it gives incentives to the supply to accelerate the build-up.
And just look at what's happening on hydrogen, right? I mean, and we can debate whether there's a bit of hype in the hydrogen world, and there probably, there's always a bit of these things. But all of a sudden, we're seeing gigawatts of hydrogen get at least, people are talking about projects. They're not talking about macro, kind of targets. There are specific projects in specific geographies, targeting specific, if you will, demand pools at specific pricing points, right? So we're seeing people say, well, look, we can't do, $1 a kilogram today for hydrogen. Everybody knows that. But we can imagine, right, being at $2, right, in the second half of the 2020s. But in order to get to $2 and have the electrolyzers come in and combine it with the renewable energy, because I want green, not gray, right? And these differentiations are critical. This is the scale of demand that's needed to be able to, if you will, drive economies of scale through the value chain. And because it's also capital intensive, to de-risk the finance and to drive down the cost of capital. Geraldine, I can see you want to jump in.
Well, I'm triggered by, if you look at the achievements so far of a lot of companies who've committed to net zero by 2050, 40, whenever, the first part of the curve, you switch to renewable electricity. Comparatively, the simpler part of the equation. As you have to go to really addressing your scope 3 and you need to start committing long-term with the industries that supply you in order for that to happen. I mean, we come from the heavy side and from the hard-to-abate side. In the time frames, you don't put the kind of facilities on the ground within less than 5 years for, and depending on the technology, even potentially longer, because you have to do pilot plants, etc. So the willingness to put commitments, and it's actually maybe an interesting thought to take forward, is of the private sector to commit to its own supply chain with horizons which are aligned with the physical realities of that. So if you want to go from fertilizers, for example, to go away from the fossil source to a renewable source, that requires very significant investments, but also a commitment to buy when it will be there. And have the conviction that by the time you get there, the consumers will be waiting for it. So RE, you will have that early mover advantage. And that's why it's so great that actually this early mover coalition is starting to awaken to that. Because for me, the biggest step that we're making right now is we've gone from what can we do on our own to what can we only do if we work together. And that wasn't really here or really acted on until quite recently in terms of the business environment. So I'm very triggered by your thoughts because it's fully correct.
So now we're getting a bit, to the end of the discussion, and I thank you again for all the very compelling examples that you gave on the actions that you're driving. But we need to talk also about the barriers and what prevents you to go faster, what I call the stone in the shoe. So that's a question that I would like to ask the three of you. So who wants to start?
I can go first if you want.
Stones.
I have a lot of stone. No, look, assuming that we can get our house in order, which is already a challenge in itself, right? Because you have cultural, internal barriers, and you have resource allocation, and you have short-term, long-term resource allocation within our own companies. But assuming we can get that managed, which is something that at least we can control, from our side, there's 4 or 5 big things that we need to get done and require both policy and technology. But I would say policy, one of the big pivots I was saying earlier is make sure we can help farmers become profitable, as you were saying, carbon sinkers, and that requires reg agriculture and some other practices and measurements. So that's one pivot where we need the right policies and the right players like us trying to incentivize them. So that's one big pivot. From our side, the other one is obviously electrical or green energy or clean energy tracking or transportation. That's another big kind of ecosystem infrastructure that is required. We move a lot of things around, so we need to move into that space. The other one we haven't talked about is packaging. Packaging is a big component for all the consumer goods industry. We're all trying to improve recycling. We're trying to develop new packaging materials, biocompostable, and move consumers, as I said earlier, with SodaStream into new consumption models. Between that triangle, I think we can solve for packaging. We need clearly governments to help us with the infrastructure that is required, both on the, I would say, consumer collection and then the actual processing of the materials. Europe has it figured out. I would say the rest of the world hasn't. So that's a big pivot that we need to make. And the fourth one, if you think about us as a big consumer company and what we were discussing earlier, we need somehow an easy to understand environmental labeling for consumers. We need to agree on, from the different industries and the multiple governments, we need an easy to understand way to tell consumers this is a better product than this other product in terms of the climate impact. And that's not so obvious. And what we don't want is, ideally, 25 different schemes in Europe, for example, right? Where we have supply chains that are integrated, or we don't want the US to be too different from other parts of the world. So hopefully here we can get somehow a standard that helps us tell consumers the same way we're somehow doing with nutrition. I think there are some codes that are easy to understand. Consumers can figure out what they are eating, and if they don't make that call, it's not because there's no information, it's because they prefer other things. The same we need to do with environment. So those are big pivots that we need. They require technology. They require, I would say, a good political policy framework. I wouldn't say political, policy framework that we all need to engage on. I must say there is better than ever collaboration, I feel, between the private and the public sector. From the conversations we're having, before there was not so much trust. I think there is, increased perception that without the private sector, the public sector will not make it. And also we realize, obviously, that we need the public sector to make certain things happen. So I think that dialogue is there at the higher level. Hopefully we can make progress. I'm hopeful that with all these pledges and commitments that all the governments are making, that we're going to make some courageous decisions in certain areas that are critical. So those are my stones. They are not small stones, they're big stones.
That was I was
hopefully
going
I can
to say. I mean, they're as big as the shoe. But yes, taking it one after the other, we'll find solutions, I'm sure.
Well, I agree with those stones, and I've got a couple of others. But one is intensely practical. I mean, I hear of example after example, and you alluded to this in a way, Geraldine, where there's a good idea on the table, there's even a project proposal, but to actually getting it to turn into an asset that's then delivering takes 5 years, whereas it could have taken 18 months because the permitting or the planning permission or the objections, and we're just going to run into this all the time. I guarantee you, we need to electrify the economy, the global economy. We will need to do it everywhere with clean electrons in one form or another. We are going to run into massive, massive permitting, local planning, NIMBYism, all the rest of it. And it's not that it's badly intentioned, but if we cannot speed up those cycles, right, to get right down into the detail of getting that equipment and those factories and those, those wind farms or whatever up and running, we'll miss the timeline. Right? We're still operating when it comes to all of that stuff as if it was business as usual and we don't have an emergency and all the rest of it. And it's why there's so much, kind of, I think, unhappiness that there's all the blah, blah and nothing's happening. So we need a revolution on that stuff. The second thing is, I do think there's a bit more trust between public and private, but not enough. We are miles away. There is instinctive distrust, and it's just deep differences of language, right, and mindset. But the assumption on the public sector side, which is every time you come for something, is just to be making more money. The only reason you would ever go and speak to them is to make more money, and your assumption is that they're always, at some level, just going to make your life insanely painful. And so there's something that we've got to. There's a big stone in that territory. This is only solved with radical collaboration, and it's a cliche and I hate it, but nonetheless, rethinking how we get to those forms of collaboration. I do think it's a new, if you will, set of disciplines. Everybody who's a CEO needs to have, if you will, done 3 major, if you will, collaborative efforts to learn and then to signal to everybody down the track that you can't be a CEO unless you know how to do this stuff, right? Because it's so critical. And then the last thing, which has not been mentioned here, but I think we all know it's a huge, huge stone, is that this is a business conversation, but don't think for a moment that business leaders fail to pay attention to the social consequences. We will only solve for climate and nature and all the other things that we've been talking about if we do so in a way that increases the justice and the sense of, a positive social outcome for those that today don't get it, right? And our business strategies and our approaches and all this fine words of collaboration, they have to have social justice integral to make them, if you will, credible and to deliver the outcomes that we want to see.
Jeremy, thanks so much for mentioning the just transition, which was a bit the missing point that we didn't discuss so far. Geraldine, in 1-2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. You're running out of time. That's fine. Actually, it's a build because a lot of things have been said. So in 2 things, in terms of the food systems, I think there's one fundamental thing is subsidies. Now, if we look at the commitments, etc., the UN Food System Summit did a great job this year at starting to bring all of the ministerial elements of a country to think about food and just transition. There's 1 billion farmers in the world, of which nearly half live in extreme poverty. This is not a sector where there's a lot of money floating around. So we do need the subsidies to be right. And how can we work together, private sector, public sector, to shift that? Really, to support regenerative agriculture needs to come with a way of funding the start and the ongoing. And that links, of course, to a meaningful price on carbon, because that is one of the mechanisms. So that's one of the stones in our shoes when we're looking at, for instance, the scaling of behaviour, which I talked about, very practical example. How do we make that good news for the farmers? And if we always start by thinking about how do we make it good news for the vast majority of people in the chain, not the few, but the many, then I think we get much quicker action and a speeding up of conversations and decisions. And that, for now, is still very rare, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. So before I turn to Maria for the conclusion, there's one dimension that you didn't mention. I mean, it's not an exam. Huh? You didn't mention people and capabilities internally.
I said we need to fix our own house.
So you think that there's a capability gap?
Well, I mean, there's I think first is culture, and you know, our associates are consumers, and if consumers are not ready, our associates are not either. So we have to do a lot of education, and we're doing that. I think we can move that needle. The other one is some technological skills that we need, for sure. For sure, there are some capabilities, but they're available. That's not the barrier. I don't think that's the barrier.
So probably it's good news. Yes, there are some capabilities to be developed, but you don't see it as important as the others that you've mentioned, which I think is pretty good news. It means that our companies will be able to adapt.
It might be in some other industry.
Yeah, but I think a lot of the capabilities will be built through action, right? I mean, we're not going to go and build capabilities. It's getting on with the things that Ramon and Geraldine have described, and using those very consciously as devices to build capabilities that are across the board. Look, I mean, we're going to have to learn not just new technical skills. I mean, we don't know how to run, you know, grid systems in an electrified world that depend on, you know, intermittent renewable technology. That's endless capabilities. But the biggest one I think you described in a sense is getting those cultures and mindsets right, and recognizing that, my goodness, if we work together, we can solve this. And someone who used to be my competitor could actually be my ally on this. And the government guys are actually essential, because we can't solve this if I don't reform the subsidy regime. So there are endless capability requirements.
So let me thank you, all of you. I think it has been a very, very exciting panel. And Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Really, really interesting discussion. So I'll share my takeaways from this session. The first one is anticipation. So anticipation, we need to halve emissions by 2030. So I don't know how much anticipation, I mean, it is something that needs to be done today. The second key area that we discussed is value chain, scope 3 emissions. So it seems that more or less, and the capability discussion was also around this. What you can do in-house, companies know how to do it, but when it comes to the external, to the farmers, to the value chain, the different approaches that are needed, Mission Possible Partnership is one of them. And the third thing that was really important is that food and ag is really the how to abate. It is not because of the volume of emissions, but it's because of the volume of players that we need to transform. So I can't leave this without making some publicity, but we launched the SME Climate Hub, which is a mechanism to engage with SMEs, which are your farmers, to educate them and to bring them on the journey, which addresses the issue around the just transition. It's only if we build the capacity outside of our companies that we can accelerate progress. And that is something that there's not a particular incentive, and where collaboration is going to be fundamental. With that, I thank you for being with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the week, and I hope also you report back the enormous progress that we are achieving at this COP. Thank you.